In the second part of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Two Towers, we come to meet Theoden, king of Rohan. At first, he's under the spell of the evil wizard Saruman. But Gandalf thwarts the plan of his old wizardly comrade by knocking some sense back into Theoden. And while the king has been freed from this evil grasp, there are still ramifications from his time under the spell. For one, Theoden comes to learn that his son Theodred had died defending the land that had been ignored by the ensorcelled king. The scene in the film version of the story is particularly touching as Theoden says the words, "Alas, that these evil days should be mine. The young perish, and the old linger. That I should live to see the last days of my house." And after Gandalf gives counsel that the fall of his house was not Theoden's fault, the king adds, "No parent should have to bury their child." Again, Gandalf speaks words meant for comfort, but the king weeps without reservation for his son, his fallen son. Gandalf walks a few paces away in order to take his leave, but notices a rider on the horizon. No, two riders, on the same horse. Siblings, brother and sister. Dirty, tired, and scared. But just as this realization hits the wizard, the exhausted boy flops off the horse. He's not dead, but he is in a terrible situation. Their arrival carries a terrible message that the kingdom is in the midst of being ravaged by the forces of evil. It's word to the king that while he might totally be right to grieve the death of his son, he still has a kingdom to lead. There's still a job to do, still people to save. Other people's sons and daughters who might still be capable of having a life, if only Theoden steps in to take his role as king, even as he grieves. This is not at all to say that Theoden just needs to man up, wipe his tears away, and act like none of this ever bothered him. No, I'm not saying that. The king was right to grieve. He was right to process his loss completely so that he could do his job as king even better. But if he were to totally ignore the plight of those people under his leadership, if he were to leave them to their own devices so that he could grieve by himself alone, then he might as well have never been freed from Saruman's spell, because that state would be exactly the same for the people under his care. Yes, it's important for us to grieve and feel the negative human emotions. Pushing them down and ignoring them will only make the pain and depression stronger. But we must also recognize that our grief and anxiety travel far beyond us. We all have someone else counting on us, someone who is let down if we do not show up, someone who's abandoned to their own devices when we let the depression and anxiety shut us down to non-functionality. Again, this is not to say that we should plaster on a fake smile, ignore the pain, and act like our lives are the best ever. I'm not saying that. Feel your pain, process the grief and depression. But also don't let your loss be the reason for someone else to grieve the loss of you from their life. Don't abandon the kingdom to the forces of evil just because you grieve the death of the prince. Instead, let the grief fuel your reign, so that other sons and daughters are not lost, because you were too busy with your grief to recognize theirs. While most of us will need to speak of kingdoms and princes in a metaphorical manner, those words are exactly what King Theoden needed to hear. And they're what King David needs to hear in our passage for this sermon from 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 19 to chapter 19 verse 8. We've been in the Absalom section of David's story arc for quite some time. Almost half of our time from the book of 2 Samuel so far, to be honest. A section begun way back when David had allowed lust and murder to ensorcel him into inaction. And now, as he's been in the process of breaking free from that sinful spell, he's found a broken kingdom, and a son who led a rebellion that broke it. In the last sermon, we saw David plead with his 3 generals to deal gently with Absalom, but Joab disregarded the wishes of his king and uncle, the general himself dealing the first of the death blows against the throne-usurping prince. Meanwhile, David had remained back in the city walls, as his men had recommended he do, but he awaits news of battle, awaits to hear the desired word of his son's safety and the return of the kingdom to his hands. We, the audience, know that half of that news will not be as good as David wants it to be, but he doesn't know that yet. And that is where we pick up the passage for the sermon, with the sending of news to the king by 2 different messengers. 2 Samuel chapter 18, verses 19 to 23. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Let me run and carry news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hands of his enemies." And Joab said, "You're not to carry news today. You may carry news another day, but today you shall carry no news, because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to the Cushite, "Go, tell the king what you have seen." The Cushite bowed before Joab and ran. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, "Come what may, let me also run after the Cushite." And Joab said, "Why will you run, my son, seeing that you will have no reward for the news?" "Come what may," he said, "I will run." So he said to him, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. Ahimaaz was one of the two priestly spies that David had used to bring news of Absalom's movements in Jerusalem. He was a trusted young man with a proven track record of bearing word to David about what had been going on throughout this entire episode. He had been there for the early news of Absalom's rebellion, so it only made sense that he should be there for the final news of the rebellion's end. This is why Ahimaaz went to Joab, in order to ask permission to be the one sent with news to the king. News that Yahweh had delivered David from the hand of his enemy. This word for delivered is also sometimes translated as judged. The idea being that the God of Israel had judged David's place and found favor in him. Judged David's side to be the side of justice. The word is from the same family of words that the title of the book of Judges gets its name. The judges being God's representatives to judge, deliver, and save Israel from whatever enemy had oppressed them this time. But Joab refused Ahimaaz's request, probably because the general knew that the king would not take the news very well. Why send a good and trusted messenger with news that could get him killed? This is probably why Joab told the young man that he would carry news another day, but not today. And also why Joab called for the nameless foreigner, a Cushite, to be the one with the news. But after the Cushite headed out, Ahimaaz went back to Joab asking to please be sent too. And he began his request with the words, "Come what may. Whatever happens, however this whole thing pans out." Ahimaaz knew that there could be a terrible reaction to the news. He understood that David would grieve Absalom's death, but there was something else that the king should focus on. Something else that should take his eye rather than the grief over his son. Something more important for the kingdom. And who knows if they could count on the other messenger to emphasize the victory for the kingdom over the loss of the prince. Come what may, there was a focal point that needed to be given above everything else, for the good of the kingdom as a whole. But Joab had yet to understand the priestly spy's perspective. He thought that Ahimaaz was just interested in trying to get the messenger's pay. He flat out tells Ahimaaz there would be no point for the second messenger, not without some other news to report. However, Ahimaaz says again, "Come what may. Whatever happens, however this pans out, I want to run and speak news to the king." At this, I see Joab chuckle, shake his head as he says, "All right, go ahead. Run with your news." The end of verse 24 tells us that Ahimaaz took a different route than the Cushite, and so he outran his counterpart. Likely the Cushite took a more direct but harsher route, and so while Ahimaaz's route covered more mileage, the path was much easier and smoother to tread. And interestingly, each of the messenger's choice of routes matches their respective methods in how to bring news to the king. So let's first look at David's perspective on Ahimaaz's words. 2 Samuel chapter 18, verses 24 to 30. Now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall. And when he lifted up his eyes and looked, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out and told the king. And the king said, "If he is alone, there is news in his mouth." And he drew nearer and nearer. The watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gate and said, "See, another man running alone." The king said, "He also brings news." The watchman said, "I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." And the king said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." Then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, "All is well." And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." And the king said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was." And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. David was anything but comfortable as his soldiers were off to battle. He wasn't sitting in some plushly decorated area. No, he stayed in a place between the city's two sets of walls. A number of well-defended cities had two sets of walls to defend against invaders, with the gates offset from one another, twice the barrier to gain forced entry. And some also had small rooms in the innermost of those two walls for the city's defenders to sit, or even fire arrows through small slits, should an enemy get in between the walls. And it was likely in one of these areas that David had chosen to remain until his men returned. But up on top of the wall, watchmen peered into the horizon for any approaching figures. One watcher noticed such a figure approaching and called out the arrival of the lone man. And David sprung up with the news. It's just one guy. It means it's got to be a messenger. Something's happened, something big. David's hope rises in him. Could this all be over? Could Yahweh have delivered his kingdom along with David's son back to him? I almost see David rocking in anticipation for the faintest of hints at what the man's news was. And the watchman probably saw it too, so he peered out again. But he saw another man running a distance behind the first. Then, as David wondered as to why there was a second messenger, the watcher reported that the running of the first was like the running of Ahimaaz. I'm not sure how Ahimaaz's method of running could be distinct over other runners, but since the young man's arrival had often been expected with news ever since this whole thing with Absalom started, the watchman would certainly have become accustomed to whatever distinction that was. Much like how someone could tell who just walked up behind them by their footsteps, or who just pulled into the driveway based off the sound of their car. With mention of Ahimaaz, David's hope grew more. The young priest was personally trusted. If Joab had sent him, then it was something incredibly important. To David's mind, it had to be good, amazing even. Little did David know the truth about that desired news. Then the breathless voice of Ahimaaz calls out, enough for David to hear him. All is well. It was good news indeed. Victory. When Ahimaaz got to the king, he bowed and breathlessly praised Yahweh for his deliverance. But the word translated as delivered in verse 28 is a different one from the one he used in verse 19. This word has the idea of deliverance by shutting down or closing off. Deliverance by having the one who raised his hand against the king be handed over. Now, you might be asking, why am I making such a big deal about the different words used for deliverance? What's the difference? Well, I believe, and freely admit that I am reading a little bit into the text for this, but I believe that the context gives me reason to hold this perspective. I believe that Ahimaaz wanted David to focus on the victory of Yahweh against this rebellion, instead of focusing on the death of Absalom. Thus, his word choice of having the opposition being shut down, instead of judged, softens the blow just enough that David might be able to focus on his appointed role as king of Israel, instead of father of a now dead son. It's not to deny David the truth, or to make him shut up the grief that will come, but rather Ahimaaz seems to have wisely decided to remind David of his role as God's chosen king, so that David can use the bad news as swiftly arriving as reason to do his kingly role while grieving. Let the grief of his rebellious son's death be a driving force to protect the people from other rebellions that are likely to follow. Keep other fathers from having to bury their sons as well. And we see this perspective of Ahimaaz in his answer to David's question of Absalom's well-being. It almost looks like Ahimaaz lies in verse 29 when he withholds the complete truth from David. When Joab sent Ahimaaz, there was a great commotion, and Ahimaaz might not have known everything that was going on there, but he did know that Absalom had died. Joab told him straight out. The young priest could have told David the truth, hit him with the harshness of the bad news, but Ahimaaz keeps that from the king. He knows that the Cushite is coming soon, following closely behind him. The news of Absalom's death is almost here, but this priestly messenger desires to direct David's heart to the blessing of Yahweh's victory, more than the punishment of one who rebelled against God's chosen king. Because Ahimaaz knows that there's still a job that God has for David, people under his leadership that need a king, even if he must hold on to his grief while he leads. A leader's grief expands to all of those under their protection. If we sink into ourselves, abandoning those who depend upon us, then we bring defeat to the victory of God. We refuse to join God in his mission for us on this planet. We are allowed to grieve, but we're not supposed to leave. Don't choose to vacate the position God has for us right at the moment he gives it back to us. Use it to do good in the place that God has appointed for us. Both the good news and the bad news will come, but come what may. Let us continue the path that God has appointed for us. There is a time to mournfully grieve, but it must not come at the expense of others who depend upon us. This is what I believe Ahimaaz attempts to get David to focus on. But David has felt too responsible for the sins of his children, so much so that Absalom is all that he can think about. So the king tells Ahimaaz to stand aside and hear what the second messenger has to say. But we all know that it's bad news. 2 Samuel chapter 18, verses 31 to 33. And behold, the Cushite came, And the Cushite said, "Good news to my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all those who rose up against you." The king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man." And the king was deeply moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom! Would I had died instead of you! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" The second messenger starts out almost the same as Ahimaaz. The news is good because Yahweh had delivered. But this word for delivered is the judged word again from verse 19. It's a hint at the harshness of the Cushite's coming words. Just as how it seems that the Cushite chose a more direct but harsh path to arrive to the city, so too does his choice of words take a direct and harsh path for David's question about Absalom's well-being. "Oh, may it be that like him are all of your enemies to be treated, O king." That's not what David needed to hear, and certainly not what he wanted to hear. Those words sounded like rejoicing in a harsh and negative consequence for Absalom, not the gentle dealing that David desired. And so the truth crushed David's spirit. That desired hope that had been rising finally crashed down upon him, smothering him in grief. The victory of Yahweh, lost in the midst of grief, despair, and depression. All because David's focus shifted from Yahweh's victory toward only the loss. In this moment, David forgets that there are many who will grieve the loss of their king's presence. Many who have just suffered a civil war and need their own comfort. Comfort that should come from God's appointed leader in their lives. The leader who should join his people in the loss and give them guidance even as he grieves himself. Show them how a leader grieves even as he leads. Be an example of how to deal faithfully with an unwanted outcome. But he focuses only on his son Absalom. Even his repetitious words point to this fact as he literally shuts himself off from everybody else. Fearing what others might think of his trembling body, he runs to hide in a nearby room. However, God has more for him to do. Something that includes his grief, yes, but is far more than just that. And the message is also not an easy one to hear in the midst of grief, especially when another messenger forgets tact in his words. 2 Samuel chapter 19, verses 1 to 8. It was told Joab, "Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard that day, "The king is grieving for his son." And the people stole into the city that day as people who steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. The king covered his face, and the king cried out with a loud voice, "Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Then Joab came into the house of the king and said, "You have today covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who have this day saved your life and the lives of your sons and your daughters, and the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased. Now therefore arise, go out and speak kindly to your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, that a man will stay with you this night. And this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now." Then David arose and took his seat in the gate. And the people were all told, "Behold, the king is sitting in the gate." And all the people came before the king. Now Israel had fled every man to his own home. I feel, as usual, of two minds about Joab. His message is right, but his method is wrong. When he heard that the king's mournful grief and depression had affected the entire army under David, Joab had had enough. Those warriors slunk back into the city without fanfare or rejoicing in God for the victory that he had provided. They looked more like deserters from an imminent defeat than victors who stomped the opposition. None would look upon them with pride, but with stares of, "It's because of you that our king has abandoned us for his grief." All of those warriors' efforts in pain and loss were treated as nothing, a net negative for the kingdom. Saying their morale was low would be an understatement. So Joab bursts into the room where David had locked himself, and the general lays out his frustration at the grieving father. The method is wrong. Words like what Joab will say need to be given out of love and care and concern, not out of frustration. That's just Joab showcasing his own grief in a fist-clenching manner, instead of trying to help out David and the kingdom. It's wise to speak truth to the grieving and depressed, but we must make sure that the truth is not attached to a weapon of death and destruction. So let's focus on the truth instead of Joab's frustration. David's grief and refusal to join his people in the somber victory showed to the soldiers that the king cared more for the enemy than he cared for them. It seemed like they had fought for a throne that the king would rather have had remained in the rebels' hands. That the whole army could have died fighting if only Absalom, the usurping murderous prince who raped women, had lived. A king who cares like that is not one to follow, not one to devote your life to. It's a surprise that the army hadn't already left him. The problem is not that the king loved those who hated him. That is godly. Jesus tells us that in the Gospels. It was good that David had desired reconciliation with Absalom, but the problem was with the perspective that the king hated those who loved him. He had abandoned them to their loss because of his. They were left with a broken kingdom and a king who vacated his throne. Again, the problem is not that David grieved, but that his grief returned him to the inaction that had plagued him for years. Yahweh had appointed David to represent him on the throne, and God is not inactive when we need him most. He grieves with us, stands beside us. He enfleshed himself in humanity and died to pay for our sins, bore our punishment, and calls us to be reconciled with him. He uses our pain to bring his beauty into the world. That's part of the reason why I started Brushstrokes of a Theonerd to begin with, so that he could transform the pain of this life into ecstatic beauty. To use my passion and pain to portray the ecstasy and joy and magnificence of our world and our Lord. My depression and anxiety and lifetime of dwelling in the depths of darkness could have left me curled up in a ball, pushing away everyone who tried to get near. And trust me, there are still days where that temptation is strong. But I still have a call from God, an appointed role in his plan. And God uses my struggle with hopelessness to bring hope to others. I get to join God in saying that pain, grief, loss, depression, anxiety, and the questions of our minds don't disqualify us from life with him. He can use them to strengthen our faith and strengthen the faith of others if we let him work through our pain to bring his beauty into the darkness of this world. Light is all the more bright when we have been in the darkness. Beauty all the more stunning after wallowing in this world's ugliness. A red-eyed leader with tear-stained face is worth following, but an absent leader was never worth following to begin with. Let's show the people around us how to live a faithful and godly life while in the midst of our problems, our pains, our grief, our depression. Show those who depend on us that they are worth so much to us, loved so much by us, that we would rather let them see us in our pain than abandon them to it. We would rather look weak to all of the world than leave them grieving with the loss of us. We'd rather be open and honest with them about our struggles than plaster on one more happy face that will only create separation and destruction. And through that, God can bring forth his victory in a way that no one else can. Thankfully, David took the truth well. He got up and sat on the judgment seat of the king in front of all of the people, not in the guise of one who has it all together, but with what I am sure were still red-rimmed eyes. Good times and bad times will come for us all, but no matter what, we should never cause grief in others just because we are grieving. Come what may, let us continue to serve as God has appointed for us. Grieve, yes, feel your feelings, but don't let them cause us to abandon the role that God has for us in the lives of others. There are still people out there counting on us, other sons and daughters who yet live, if only we step up to lead, guide, and protect. I will never say that this is an easy thing. It'll be among the more difficult things in our lives to do, but the beauty God brings from it is worth all of the pain. And if you don't believe me, look to Jesus, who suffered far more than any of us will ever experience, as the wrath of God for all of our sin poured out on him on the cross. He endured the cross for the joy of bringing life to those who follow him. Pain considered to be little in the light of God's beautiful reconciliation with his faithful creation. Let us join our God and Savior in living a beautiful life of true faithfulness, instead of abandoning others to the grief we cause by our absence. It'll look different in everybody's situation. Your pain and grief and depression will look different from mine and other people's. And who it is that depends on us will be different as well. But I can say that for all of us, it will require honesty and humility to stand before those we care for while grieving. but the truth will mean so much more to the people we care for than our absence. And if you feel like you don't have the strength to do this, remember that God is right there with us, grieving with us, ready to give us His strength. Come what may, be an example of how to grieve without leaving. Be present for others, even while in the midst of pain. God's beauty will certainly follow those who continue in the role He has appointed for us.